Our next speaker is Thara Pixley. Dr. Thara Pixley is a photojournalist, documentary maker, and professor with a 20-year career in visual journalism. Dr. Pixley is based in Los Angeles, where she teaches journalism and media studies at Loyola Marymount University. She is a recipient of inaugural World Press Photo Award, Solution Journalism Network's Solutions Visual Journalism Initiative grant, and completed a visiting night fellowship at prestigious Harvard University Neyman Foundation for Journalism. Her writing and photography have appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, NPR, Newsweek, ProPublica, HuffPost, Neiman Reports, ESPN magazines, Canon Pro, and Black Scholar. Thara's film and photographic work intersect with her scholarship and advocacy, each addressing the problematics of representation and the possibility of contemporary visual media to reimagine marginalized communities. She is co-founder and board member of Authority Collective, an organization dedicated to diversifying perspectives in visual media. And she is currently working on a book chronicling the move to decolonize the visual journalism industry. Title of the session is Visualizing Solutions, Telling Complex Stories. Welcome, Thara.
Thank you so much. And hello to everyone watching today. Thank you all for being here with us. And thank you to my fellow presenters. I love listening to your research and your experiences. And I'm going to build a little off of some of the things that you've already heard today. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. To add a little bit of context to that, my work in photojournalism has shifted over the years as I worked as a photo editor in international or for international news organizations. I began to realize that we were missing some stories, or we were missing rather the complexity of certain visual narratives that we were telling in our photojournalistic coverage of the most important issues of our day. And part of why that was happening is because I believe rather, part of why that was happening is because we didn't have as diverse of a group of photojournalists that would allow for far more diverse visual perspectives and a diversity of lived experiences that inform the work that we do. And as I started to notice that, I began to think about how do we include, or how do we rather achieve that diversity of visual narratives and include far more diverse approaches to visual storytelling. And so I decided to get my PhD in communication so that I could think more deeply about these issues and write about them, as well as continue my work as a visual journalist. And that is what led me ultimately to solutions journalism and solutions visual journalism. I started to think that perhaps this emphasis on the negative imagery, this sort of like gloom and doom, wasn't working. It didn't inspire people to feel that they can address these issues. It doesn't necessarily give the complexity and a holistic representation of what is happening in these contemporary issues. And that's where I think solutions journalism specifically can be really impactful. I'm going to start my presentation. Can everyone see that? Okay. I looked up the best of photojournalism, and this is what Google Images suggested. A majority of these photos, like most photojournalism, depicts tragedy, chaos, devastation, or death. And this is what people expect documentary images to show them, I think. And this is often what our photojournalistic industry awards. It's what we model our own work after when we are aspiring or emerging photojournalists. When you see that these are the kinds of images that win awards, this is the way to approach storytelling, then that becomes replicated, reproduced over and over again. But as we have, some of our other speakers have touched on, that isn't what gets people to respond to the problems of climate change, the problems that Daniel spoke to. People often respond better, and audiences respond better to images that they can connect with. And while it's important to see and recognize the severity and the sort of impact of these world issues, we also need to help people feel empowered. Studies indicate that 48% of people avoid news because it's so negative. That's a Reuters Institute digital news report from 2017. So that's almost half of news audiences that are saying they're avoiding news because it's too negative. People respond more positively to news coverage that highlights what people can do to respond to a problem, or what people are doing, rather than focusing specifically on the problem itself or only on the problem itself. It gives us a sense of power over those issues of our world, and it provides a roadmap for how we become engaged, how to think about potential solutions. Visual storytelling has power. So solutions journalism has power because of the things I just spoke to, and visual storytelling has power. Visual coverage is essential to reporting news. People often notice photos first and remember them the most. We're drawn in by images. So combining that power of a solutions journalism approach, and combining the power of visual storytelling to engage audiences and engage our public, is a really powerful and incredible opportunity to sort of realize photojournalism's core tenets. And I believe that photos should tell complex stories. I'm going to go to the next slide, but I'll explain these images more in a moment. I believe photos should tell complex stories, and that our mission is to inspire deeper empathy between audiences and the lived experiences of those photographed. We can't really convey the lived experience of people. We can't really tell those complex stories if we aren't engaging what's happening to people beyond the issue itself. And I believe that photos can evince empathy in audiences as well. Photojournalists often seek to connect people worlds away from each other. We, as Renee was saying, we often, I have never seen a polar bear, unfortunately. And while I might love to see polar bears, and or I might be affected and impacted by seeing polar bears in distress or in danger due to climate change, I can't connect with it and on the same level. I need the surrounding context to make it impactful, more impactful for me. And that's true of most stories that we tell. We need to find ways to connect people to what is happening worlds away from them, so that they understand, they see themselves. There's sympathy, where you recognize the sorrow of another, and there's empathy, where you actually feel it, where you can connect what is happening to someone else to what has happened or could happen to you. That is empathy, and that is ultimately, or should be rather, the goal of photojournalism. And photos often act as evidence. So visual perception theory tells us that we often believe what we see above other information. Our eyes are connected to our cognitive reasoning in particular ways, and visual information gets sort of put above other forms of information. So telling true stories through images can convey meaning that provide the necessary evidence to understand a problem is real and that it must be addressed. I believe the solutions approach to visual journalism can provide that additional context that I said is important, a holistic and thorough engagement with the individuals, with the communities, and the environments that we cover as photographers. That produces the kind of knowledge on issues that motivates action in audiences. And I believe that is what we are striving to do as photojournalists. If we're taking images, if we're photographing and documenting the world's most pressing issues, the most important news stories, why would we do that work if we weren't hoping that our images would create the impact that might affect change on these issues? We aren't doing it just, for our own edification. We aren't doing it just because we enjoy photographing tragedy or sorrow or problems. We're doing it because we hope that it will spur people to act. And if we want people to feel like they can act, then we have to, again, give them the sense of empowerment, this recognition of what can be done. We have to introduce them to the solutions. So a solutions-focused visual story seeks to explain that underlying problem and portray existing responses to those problems. It also provides a framework for the viewing public that may inspire and empower further change making, right? Which again is the goal. And another thing that's very important to me is that a solutions approach can avoid relying on stereotypes. It's very easy for us to kind of focus on the simplistic othering of people in our images, of blank-faced people of color as the sort of de facto image to illustrate a human rights issue. Portraying expressionless faces in far-flung places does not actually make change. It doesn't inspire people. It doesn't make an impact in the same way that photos of more holistic lived experience does. And images of graphic and horrific violence don't inspire, again, that lasting and change-making empathy at the level that other kinds of imagery can and do. So neither of these kinds of photographs either kind of move forward an understanding of what's being done to address the problem. And I say that solutions visual journalism expands our visual narrative. In order to tell stories accurately and truthfully, we need to move beyond that kind of victim or victimization of particular individuals, that victim narrative of individuals or communities. And we should begin by understanding that the topics and communities we portray, moving outside of that kind of understanding of people as subjects and thinking more about them as fellow humans, and what kind of stories would we want to be told about ourselves when we're having, when we're in spaces of chaos or devastation. Exemplary journalism highlights the commonalities between human struggles, and solutions journalism unpacks attempts to mitigate those struggles. A successful visual journalist working in the solutions journalism framework will recognize shared humanity and strive to emphasize that in their image. Additionally, we should always be providing very thorough and contextualizing captions that give our audiences a real understanding of what is happening, why is it happening, what is it related to. So these images that I'm showing here are actually from the project I'm working on with the World Press Photo Solutions Journalism Initiative grant that I received. And unfortunately, it's a little bit on hold right now due to COVID, or it has been rather for the last 6 months. I'm hoping to be able to return to Tijuana and have the ability to cross the border and continue photographing communities there. But just to give a little bit of context, in December 2018, these two photos you see here from December 2018, I decided to go down. I live in Los Angeles, and at the time I lived in San Diego, and I decided to go to Tijuana and photograph what was happening at the border. I had several colleagues and friends who were working as activists and migrant advocates there when one of the largest migrant caravans out of Central America had finally come to the border, the US-Mexico border. And so there were several thousand people who came in that migrant caravan in late 2018. And those people were not allowed to cross the border. They were kind of stuck in Tijuana and at various other cities along the US-Mexico border. And they were in dire straits. There was not a lot of food for them. There was not a lot of resources. They were being kind of contextualized in American news media as, rather than contextualized as refugees, they were contextualized as terrorists or criminals, people who were trying to invade America. And that was just factually inaccurate. These were people who were fleeing danger, who were fleeing gang violence, starvation, climate change that was pushing them out of being able to, kind of feed their families and things like that. And I'm always interested in the work of activists, how those actions take form, what changes it seeks to enact, and what actions and interventions are made. And so I decided to come to Tijuana, excuse me, to photograph what was happening here at El Baratal shelter. And that's what's pictured here. So these are images of a day I spent with a dance company, Contra Tiempo dance company, that is based out of LA. They came down to Tijuana to visit and work with some of the migrants and asylees, the people who are seeking asylum. And their goal was to engage them in dance, to engage them in aerial yoga, as you see here, and to sort of offer them a connectivity. The Contra Tiempo dancers and the dance company, they spoke about it as bringing radical joy, the possibility of experiencing joy even in dire circumstances, even in this really bad or negative experience that many of the people, the migrants, were having. And so these are images. This one is Contra Tiempo dancers leading a crowd of migrants and asylees in bachata and salsa dance circles. And they also, the dancers also brought clothing, money, and other resources to provide to the asylees and the migrants. So they came with the kind of material resources that these people needed, and they came with the goal of relating to them as humans, as fellow humans, as people who need to dance, who need to sing, who need to feel seen as something other than a victim. And I wanted to photograph this happening to try and understand and to visualize what it means to bring radical joy to a community of people, to a community of refugees. I was hoping to find that there might be a visual narrative beyond the kind of typical narrative that we see of migrants and refugees, and that I might be able to capture some component of a solution here. And I use the term solution with this particular project sort of tentatively, because the term solution implies something that we know is absolutely solving the problem. We know that it works, we have data on it. And I can't say that about this particular work. I think this is something that we'll see over time. But solutions, visual journalism, doesn't only need to be validated by data or proof of the efficacy of, or the effectiveness of a particular solution or approach. It can also be validated by the lived experience, by the commentary and feedback of those you were photographing. And what I found when I was photographing, what I found when I was photographing the migrants this day in December 2018, as I spoke to them, is that they were relaying that they had this experience of radical joy, that they had this experience of being connected to. And they said that no one had done this for them. People came and brought food, they brought money, they brought clothing, they brought supplies, and that's wonderful and important and absolutely necessary. But very few people beyond these particular activists and artists, very few people brought an opportunity for them to laugh, to dance, to be together in this way that made them feel engaged and recognized beyond the idea of a victim. And so that is what created this project for me, where I wanted to photograph and focus on, or visualize rather, through images and film, how activists and advocates, and there's a kind of extensive network of people, including lawyers and various advocacy organizations and individuals who are working to produce and provide the resources that these asylees need. So it's now 2020. Many of these people, still hundreds and hundreds of Central American migrants, are at the border in Tijuana and other cities, still waiting to have their asylum cases processed, still in a lot of danger and precarity. And there's still quite a bit of scarcity of resources. And my project began to photograph on a particular shelter in Tijuana called the Casa de Luz shelter. And Casa de Luz is unique in that it brings together people from the LGBTQ community, so lesbian, gay, transgender people, alongside women or mothers and their children. So it's families and LGBTQ. And in Mexico, the Mexican government doesn't typically allow any mixing of groups like that in shelters. But what that actually produces is this sort of lack of community, lack of consistency across the shelters. Casa de Luz, by bringing together these two different communities, they've created a sort of wonderful family and community that shares resources. They eat together and cook together, and they live together in this space, and they have very little. It's quite a space of precarity, in fact, but photographing them has given me the opportunity to see that this kind of community focused work and community engagement in terms of advocacy and a network of support is producing really positive results. That even as people are struggling, many of the trans women who are at this particular shelter are frequently attacked and harassed by Mexican police. They're often, they have their asylum paperwork torn up and thrown out. They are followed and arrested for the offense of walking down the street. And so they're having things like this happening, but they always have this home to return to. And then they have people there who are working across the border to help them get asylum, to when they do actually are allowed across the border into America, then there are people on the other side of the border who are helping them with their cases there, who are following them for several months or even years at this point to make sure that they're okay. And while again, this is not a solution to a migrant, the influx of migrants, it's not a solution to the masses of asylees whose plights are being ignored, who are being turned away. It isn't a solution, but it is a possible intervention. It is a way in which we can reimagine our visual representation and our visual narratives about migrants and asylees. And one of the things I had the privilege of doing was spending some time in December 2019 at Casa de Luz with the families and individuals staying there. And they were having a posada, a celebration around Christmas time. And so they were all cooking food together. They had this piñata, rainbow piñata, for the children to play with, and seeing again, that community, that connection, the way that they are coming together despite, very unfortunate and difficult circumstances, and still finding a way to express their humanity, to be in relation to one another and have that radical joy. That's what I wanted to capture in my images. This is Irving. He's one of the people who run the shelter, and he is he's a Mexican citizen who is also gay or identifies as part of the LGBTQ community. And when he saw what was happening with the migrant caravan, he started to help people, and he started to also reach out to various different organizations and individuals and helped bring them all together. And so I'm not highlighting him here because he's just one component of this larger network of people identifying solutions and interventions to this problem, but he is, I think, an important part of the story in how he's representing, not exemplary, he's representing the ways in which average people can affect change and be creating that change with very little resources by producing a community of support. And that is the emphasis of this project, is how community itself can be a solution. And here's another image from the posada at Casa de Luz. Oh, I don't know what happened. Oh, here. Sorry. And another thing that I think is really important is the way that single mothers and mothers with children are protected, taken care of, and resourced through Casa de Luz. This is an image of a woman who had her baby actually just a few weeks after this photo was taken. It intended to photograph the baby, but due to COVID have not been able to, so the baby might be a toddler by the time I get to actually go there and see her. And this is an image again from the El Baratol shelter. It struck me, and this is the first time that I went to Tijuana and was photographing migrants and asylees there. And it struck me that this woman was holding this flag. I didn't tell her to do this. I just saw this moment and wanted to capture it. And that there were hundreds and hundreds, over 1,000 people at this shelter. They didn't have food or running water, or they didn't have consistent food rather, and other necessities that they really needed. And yet the people I saw at this shelter were hopeful, were not just victims. They were not just, struggling to survive. They were surviving, and they were doing that in a way that I found beautiful and incredible, and that I had not seen photographed and captured and kind of publicized and circulated via mainstream news media. And so that is the work that I try to do as a visual journalist, focusing on using a solutions focus, is how do we tell these more complex stories? How do we go away from relying on that victim narrative? How do we go away from relying on stereotypes, from always focusing on the sort of gloom and doom images, the worst possible, showcasing the worst things that are happening, and not pretend that that's not happening. I'm not saying that we should ignore the severity of the issues. We should also include this representation of people's humanity. We should try to understand and include how we got here. A good solutions journalism approach shows the connection and humanity behind the typical images we see of impoverished and devastated migrants or other people. It changes that visual narrative, shows how people are combating these issues of human rights and creating a supportive network with one another, or at least that's what I'm showing in this particular story. And so I know this is a brief overview, but I just wanted to kind of talk through how we can imagine our focus on solutions visual journalism, how we can, again, tell those complex stories as we try to visualize a different way of engaging the most important and pressing issues of our time. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you, Thara. Now our moderator, here we also have a Thara. So our moderator, Thara CB, will do the question answer session with Thara Pixley.
Hello, I'm happy to see another Thara from another part of the world. And myself will be moderating these questions. Okay, shall I share the screen? With the advent of smartphones or social media, the reporting giving people, especially from marginalized community, their stories, they are reporting stories from the ground. And what place does the photojournalism take in future?
Thank you. That's a great question. This is something I actually talk a lot about with my students. I also teach as a professor, I teach journalism. And the thing is, for a very long time, journalists have had a monopoly on information. And that can be, no monopoly is good. It was important to have factual information, fact-checked information based on evidence. But now we've kind of lost that monopoly. And I think that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to see the world in different ways, to hear a lot of different voices and perspectives. It's also an unfortunate opportunity for misrepresentation and misinformation. But we need to recognize and understand that the professional photojournalistic approach is important, and the approach of citizen journalists, of the public, photographing, documenting, and publicizing their own lived experiences and relationship to news events, that's just as important. I think both of them need to happen, because even though the average, you know, I hate to say average, even though every citizen or the public's images and documentation of their everyday lives or of particular news issues is also very important, they don't have the same access and professionalization and ethical code that photojournalists have. I, as a freelance photojournalist working for a major news organization, I have the ability to get entree into particular rooms, particular spaces that not everyone can do. And it's also my focus, my emphasis, right? So if I were a chef or a firefighter, or I might be able to certainly take great images of what's happening in my restaurant or as I fight wildfires, but I won't have the kind of time to really dig into and focus in depth on that story. So I think that these two things work together, and that we as photojournalists should not, as all journalists, we shouldn't be afraid of the proliferation of information online. We shouldn't be afraid of citizen journalists. We should be welcoming. We should encourage people to adhere to the same kinds of ethical standards and codes, and to make sure that the information they're circulating is true.
Thank you. Shall we move on to the next question? Here's the next question. How journalists are showcasing violence in the streets of America due to the racial hatred. How can solutions journalism help here?
Thank you for that question. I actually was going to include some of my protest images in this presentation, and I decided against it. I thought I might not have time. But I think that the reason why I wanted to include that is because we are seeing quite a lot of images that highlight the violence and the rage, the police brutality, and that is absolutely a part of the story. I am a first-generation American. My family is Jamaican, and I, as a first-generation American, am both very. It is very important to me to be politically active in this country, and to also recognize the limitations of our political sphere. To critique, I think, our nations is to show how much we actually love them because we want them to be better. And I think about that all the time in my work as a photojournalist. That's part of what led me to do the work of journalism, is that I wanted to be able to showcase what is happening and provide a perspective that I was not seeing. And so I say all of that to bring attention to my approach when I'm going to photograph protests in Los Angeles. I photographed protests from May 30th to June 30th. I haven't been back out to photograph protests recently because, frankly, I needed a little bit of a break. But what I was seeing in the streets was again that sense of community, that connection between people who have been experiencing racism, who've been experiencing police brutality their whole lives, and their allies, people who haven't necessarily experienced that personally, but who recognize that that is real, that it's happening, and that we collectively have to speak back against that kind of misuse of power. And so seeing, hundreds to thousands of people gathering in the streets of Los Angeles peacefully and speaking out against this thing that they think, needs to stop. But then going home, that's what I'm seeing personally as I attend and photograph it. And then I go home and I see the front page of newspapers, what's highlighted on CNN, Fox News, etc., is just the violence. And that violence is such a small portion of what's actually happening. So that brings me back to that importance of telling complex stories, of having a holistic visual narrative and not relying on the sort of easy, victimization, the sort of easy representation of fear and hatred and violence and sort of chaos. That's what we often get drawn to visually because it seems impactful, it seems really important, but it's not the whole story. And so I think that what photojournalists should be doing is acknowledging that, representing it when it happens, but also highlighting the importance of all of these other things that are going on. That is how we're going to tell that more accurate story of what's happening in the streets of America.
Though we have a lot of questions, we are moving on to the last question due to time constraints. This is your last question. Does photographs photos which can be connected towards personal life of a viewer in public will have much more impact in that person's perspective. These photos, which can be connected towards personal life of a viewer in the public, will have much more impact in that person's perspective.
Okay, thank you. So I think what this question is asking is if we have photos that represent the sort of, the personal relationships, the sort of background experiences that isn't just highlighting the struggles itself, will that connect more with people in the public? And I think the answer to that is yes. We have a lot of studies that show that people experience empathy when they can actually, as I was saying before, when they can actually recognize something in that story, in that image that they connect with personally. And so if we're thinking about that, whether we're in a conflict zone, whether we're photographing the aftermath of a tornado, hurricane, and earthquake, or starvation, people are experiencing drought, famine, things like that. These unfortunate and tragic things happen all around the world all the time. And photojournalism is supposed to photograph that. But, as Daniel mentioned in his talk, that when he was showing his images with that particular project, the thing that connected someone more than any of those other images of, the kind of struggle and strife that this farmer was experiencing were the two photos of the children in the suits. It's things like that that take us out of our, existing preconceptions, our existing notions of what tragedy and victims look like, and actually connect us to that personal life. Of people who are, everybody wants to look good for a picture, or everyone wants to get dressed up to go do whatever it is, to go to worship or to be, to a dinner. So those are things that we can photograph and capture in conjunction with all of these other things that are happening that will be a kind of hook for someone that will say, oh, I just did that last night, or I dressed my children up in a suit as well, and I'm 20,000 miles away from this person, but now I have this connection to them, to what they do, to the life that they're living, to who they are. And I can see myself, my own children, my neighbors, my parents, my friends, my colleagues, whoever it is, I can see them in this person that I'm looking at. And so now they are more humanized to me. They're more human, rather than this sort of dehumanizing of images of tragedy. What they produce is a sort of dehumanization. It produces a sort of like us versus them. I've never experienced that. They are experiencing that. How very sad for them, but I can't relate to it. And that's not the same. Again, that's sympathy versus empathy. And so, yes, I think that showcasing images that portray the sort of personal moments behind tragedy are just as important, if not more important, to connecting us to those people.
Thara, I think all of your photographs reflects a positive thing, and this kind of empathy is what we could see in these photographs. Thank you for being with us. Now, HOD Manju ma'am will talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Thara Pixley, for the inspiring session. It's truly essential to have diversity in front of the camera and behind the camera. Yes, photojournalists must tell visual stories of diversity, of inclusiveness. More photojournalists must come forward, breaking the shackles of the society and create visual stories that challenged the perceived norms, highlight solutions, and positiveness. We look forward to having you as a speaker for advanced training sessions in the future. Best wishes for your wide spectrum of endeavors. Thank you again.